after gun down to the clearing stations. Thousands of them, and all kinds. The tough ones with the smile froze stiff on their faces by shell fire. And the plain Joes that had too much and ready to tell you that. And their poker-faced officers that never lost the poker-faced look. The SS, the parachute troops, the old soldiers off the Russian front, I've seen them all. The Hitler youth babies looking like they walked out of Lincoln High. Expert killers. Smart Alec with their talk of rights under the Geneva Convention and asking, when do we go to America? And the other guy who crawled out of a hole with his hands up, all through and talking too much, ready to swear he hated Hitler all the time. The kids that knew how a machine gun worked and nothing else. Grinning like they were still on top, so he could hardly hold that trigger finger still. The middle-aged guys wanting to tell you about the wife and kids, you'd let them. And they were through killing when I saw them, and through getting killed, too. And some of them thought they were lucky, and others didn't. And some didn't give a... I covered them down to the rear where it was somebody's job to find out what made them tick, but it wasn't my job to figure them out. I just kept them covered. And brother, I never gave them more than the Geneva Convention. And that was all.
American tanks ground on into the east toward Paris and the Upper Seine. Before them, the Germans helter-skelter fled away and saw retreat, or stood with hands upraised by roads all littered with their smoldering gear. And still the tanks ground on beyond the smoke into the unscarred country.
A good solid map, well delineated, is an absolute must for a modern mechanized army traveling at high speed. In our division, the issuing of maps was my job. When we broke out of the Cherboug Peninsula, my department had the situation well in hand. Then, for us, everything went mad, stark, raving mad. One morning I woke up, and the army had gone right off the map, absolutely right off the map. So we rushed through an order for 500,000 maps of the Orléans region. They arrived in due time. To our horror, the army progressed far beyond the Orléans region. It was off the map again. This was a period of acute crisis for me. I gave the highest priority to a fresh order of maps of the Paris area. We refused to be licked by this situation. The final blow came when it became evident that we were going to bypass Paris. That almost finished us. Eventually, we had to drop 10 tons of maps to them by parachute. It was a very humiliating experience. I'll be glad when I get back to the Library of Congress, where maps have some permanent value.
While the Allies were fighting near Paris, we French soldiers of the Leclerc Division were fighting in the Normandy fields. And suddenly an order came. Go to Paris, it said, and take it. The Allies, after having equipped our division with tanks, guns, rifles, lorries, and jeeps, that night decided to give us Paris, too. So at 4 o'clock in the morning, the division starts rushing on the roads, and in the sky, on the right, on the left, everywhere, the American Air Force protects our trip. What a trip. 250 kilometers in one day. I think I'll tell it all the time to my grandchildren and bore them with it until I die.
At the beginning of August, we in Paris were seized by rumors. What could be confirmed was towards the middle of the month, the Germans started to leave the city. Yes, those were the same Germans who had signed 25-year leases on their apartments. Then, on the 14th, our police went on strike. The next day, the Gestapo left. That was the day, too, when a police car opened fire on a German detachment on the Place de la Concorde and began the battle for the city. After that, it seemed the French flag was hanging from every window. All the flags were made of curtains, old dresses, rags, everything, it didn't matter. 4 days later, we heard shouting coming from the Hotel de Ville. We started running. Me, my husband, everyone in our house. As we ran, people were screaming. The French army had arrived. When we got to the Place de l'Hotel de Ville, we saw it was true. I kissed my husband because he was crying we began to realize how unhappy we had been for 4 years and how lucky we were to be alive on this August evening.
The great pursuit was on. At last the Battle of France was ending, when all suddenly another D-Day stunned the shaken foe. 2 armies struck, American and French, along the broad-beached southern coast of France. Then north, the 2 new armies rolled like waves to join the forces moving on the Reich. Beyond the Seine, where from 100 sites the Germans launched their flying bombs and brought death and destruction on the English towns, our valiant armies went about the task long since assigned them. Toward the Reich frontiers, Americans advanced. Against the ports hugging the Channel, garrisoned in force by desperate foes, Canadians were sent. And in a thunderous sweep, the British armor surged toward a waiting Brussels.
People of Brussels laughed and cried and threw flowers in the tank and said, "Goodbye, Tommy," when they meant to say hello. Man, they were happy. I suppose they were no longer afraid. But I remember wondering then how the first German civilians would react to us.
I remember one day we were coming across a big flat field. Didn't look like nothing special. I hopped a barbed wire fence and a guy says to me, "Guess what?" So I says, "What?" So he says, "You're in Germany. There's a sign over there says." Then like a dope I thought, well, it won't be long now.
I won a quid over the fall of Paris and 10 bob on Brussels. And I had a fiver on it being over by October the 1st.
I remember the point system for getting out of the Army came out about this time. I began to think of that gray chalk-striped double-breasted suit and the mothballs.
I was in the 7th Army coming up from the south of France. One day a lieutenant said, "Take a ride with me. I got some prisoners for you to guard." "How many?" I says. "About 20,000, he said. A whole German division had surrendered."
We Canadians were advancing in the north. And one day we came across a thing I'd never seen before. I guess it's a flying bomb site, the officer says. Well, that really made me feel good.
The prisoner told us the newest Jerry gag. If an aircraft shows up white, it's American. If it shows up dark, it's British. And if it never shows up, it's the Luftwaffe.
Every time they sent me along to set up a forward switchboard and I got my earphones on, I found out that the rear switchboard had leapfrogged 5 miles ahead.
I wrote to the old man in St. Louis. He owns a men's store. I told him he'd better cut prices on GI neckties and socks if he didn't want to be stuck with a lot of military apparel.
Someone asked the sergeant major what he thought the chances were for a spot of leave. "Don't you worry about leave, lads," he says. "We've got the Japs to finish yet." Regular soldier, of course. Keen.
It was a terrific feeling crossing the German border. We were sure nothing could stop us.